We turn now to 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 3. We considered this last week, seeing that God's divine power has granted to us. That means He has already done His part of giving to us everything, and that's an important word. Everything excludes nothing. Everything is included, pertaining to life and godliness, through the true knowledge of Him who called us to His own glory and virtue. Now here we are also told in verse 3 as to the purpose with which God called us. He's called us to share His own glory and to share His own nature, His own virtue, His own excellence. Many people have understood the gospel as something that merely frees them from the guilt of their past life and guarantees to them a home in heaven in the future. But here we are told, like in many other letters in the New Testament that the apostles wrote, that we are called to share God's own glory. We are called to share God's own virtue. And since He has called us with this purpose, He has given to us, knowing that we ourselves are incapable of ever attaining to this by our own efforts. What has He done? He has offered to us, in verse 3, everything pertaining to life and godliness through His own divine power. This is the whole significance and meaning of being filled with the Holy Spirit. Jesus said that when the Spirit came upon His disciples, they would receive power. What for? Here we are told in 2 Peter 1:3 what that divine power is for. To be His witnesses. That is, to show forth in our lives and through our speech the living testimony of God who has come to earth in the person of Christ and who now reproduces that life in us through the Holy Spirit. Because He's called us to share His life, His glory, and His virtue. And we are told further in verse 4 that by these He has granted to us His precious and magnificent promises. Through this calling that He's spoken of in verse 3, that He has called us with before the worlds were created. Through this fact that His divine power has offered to us everything necessary for a godly life on earth, He has now granted to us His precious and magnificent promises. Notice in verse 3 and 4, this phrase, He has granted to us. Repeated again in verse 4, He has granted to us. Everything begins with God's free gift in the new covenant. If God did not offer to us His divine power and His precious and magnificent promises, there would be no hope for any of us attaining to His glory or partaking of His nature. But since He has granted to us, there is nothing to stop us from partaking of God's nature and His glory except our own unbelief. He has granted to us, Peter says in 2 Peter 1:4, His precious and magnificent promises. Now there are many promises in the Bible. There are promises concerning healing, material blessings, and many other things that relate to a comfortable life on earth. Even though there may be pressures and difficulties, promises relating to God's delivering power in the midst of difficulties. But the precious and magnificent, the most precious and the most magnificent promises are those that relate to our partaking of God's own nature. In verse 3, He speaks of the divine power. In verse 4, He speaks of the divine nature that we can partake of. And He says, these are the precious and magnificent promises, that by them you might become partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world by lust. Now, we need to see that the most glorious promises in the entire Bible are those found in the New Testament that promise to us that we can actually partake of God's own nature. It's not a perpetual struggle that we are to live in towards purity and love and humility. No, these are but the beginning. But we are to progress to the place where we partake of God's own purity, His own love, His own humility, His own goodness, His own peace, and His own joy, Jesus spoke about that on the last day of his life on earth. He said, "My peace I give unto you." You don't have to produce a peace of your own. That won't last long. But Jesus says, "My peace I give unto you. My joy I give unto you," he said. You don't have to try and work up joy in your heart. No, my joy I give unto you. The same thing for every other virtue. We're told in Galatians 5:22 and 23 that love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, meekness, faith, self-control, every virtue that characterize the life of Jesus on earth are all the fruit of the Spirit. Not the fruit of our own effort, but the fruit of the Holy Spirit producing these virtues in our life as we yield ourselves to Him and offer our hearts to Him as soil in which these virtues can grow. And so it is God who has granted us these promises, that by these we can partake of the divine nature. And he goes on to say, having escaped the corruption that is in the world by lust. Now there are two things that we can learn from that phrase. First of all, we see that all the corruption that is in the world comes through lust. The lusts and desires that dwell in the flesh of all human beings are the cause of every corruption that we find on the face of the earth. All jealousy, all strife, all competition, all unloving attitudes, words, thoughts, all bitterness, all idolatry and drunkenness and fornication, and every evil that we can think of in home, between nations, and even in many so-called Christian churches. All the lust that dwells in the flesh of people causes this corruption. And so the only way to avoid the corruption is to follow Jesus and to crucify the flesh with its affections and lusts, as it says in Galatians 5:24. Now, if we have taken that position and that attitude towards the lusts that dwell in our flesh, then we can partake of the divine nature. For we are told in this verse that you can become partakers of the divine nature having already escaped the corruption that is in the world by lust. In other words, we can't partake of God's nature if we are yielding to the lust in our flesh day by day. If, for example, in the moment of temptation, I desire to yield to the lust that's provoked in the moment of temptation, I'm thereby telling God, I want to yield to my lust. And indirectly, I'm saying to God, I do not want your nature. It doesn't sound so strong in the moment of temptation, but actually, every time I yield to temptation, I'm saying to God, I don't want your nature. And so we see something there, that in the moment of temptation, God is offering me a choice. Either satisfy your lust or partake of my nature. And if I say no to my lust, if I say no to those desires that are provoked through temptation in my flesh, I say, no, I don't want to be a part of the corruption that is in the world through lust. Then I belong to the category of people spoken of here in verse 4, having escaped, having rejected, having been pulled out by grace from the corruption that is in the world by lust. Then I can partake of the divine nature. This is why James says in James chapter 1 that we are to consider it all joy when we are tempted, because in the moment of temptation, I have the opportunity to express to God my heartfelt desire to reject the lusts that I have inherited in my flesh from Adam, and to say, Lord, I reject that, and I want the nature of Christ in every part of my life. And it is only for those who hunger and thirst for this divine nature that God reveals His magnificent and precious promises, so that they can become partakers of the nature of God. Now, how has it been in our own life? We can examine ourselves. If we have not partaken of God's joy and peace and victory, perhaps the reason lies here, that in the moments of temptation we yield to our lust. Maybe reverse the course in the days to come then, and say no to our lust, that we might partake of God's own nature.